On a dry Thursday morning in June of 1988, a man named Gerald Meeks walked into the Cimarron County Farm Bureau office in Boise City, Oklahoma, and asked to speak to someone about soil. Gerald was 51 years old. He farmed 640 acres of winter wheat southeast of town, drove a 1979 Dodge pickup that had lost its tailgate somewhere around 1983 and never got it back, and had the kind of hands that made strangers uncomfortable, cracked at every knuckle, dark in the lines. The hands of a man who had been outdoors for 30 years without ever worrying about it. The secretary at the front desk asked him what specifically about soil he needed help with, and Gerald thought about it for a moment and said he wanted to know why his neighbor's fields smelled like dirt and his didn't. That was the question. That was all of it. The woman at the desk was named Connie Pollard, and she had worked at that office for 11 years, and she had answered a lot of questions from a lot of farmers in those 11 years, and she would later tell people at the Coffee Cup Diner on Main Street, at church, at the annual meeting, that she had never once heard anyone ask that particular question. Not in 11 years. Not in the whole history of the Cimarron County Farm Bureau office, as far as she knew. She sent Gerald down the hall to speak with the extension agent, a man named Darrell Fitch, who had a master's degree in agronomy from Oklahoma State University and was very proud of it. Darrell listened to the question. He asked Gerald to repeat it. Gerald repeated it. Then Darrell told Gerald something that Gerald would think about for the rest of his life. He said, "Healthy soil isn't supposed to smell like anything." Gerald nodded. He thanked Darrell. He walked back to his truck with the missing tailgate, sat in the driver's seat for a moment in the parking lot, and drove home to his 640 acres. His neighbor's soil smelled like something alive. Gerald's soil smelled like nothing at all. He was pretty sure Darrell had it exactly backwards, and he was going to spend the next several years proving it. To understand what Gerald Meeks was up against, you have to understand what farming looked like in the Oklahoma Panhandle in 1988. And I mean, understand it the way the people who were doing it understood it, not from the outside, looking in at what now seems obvious, but from the inside, looking out, where everything seemed completely, reasonably, sensibly correct. The conventional approach to dryland wheat farming in the southern plains in the late 80s was built on 3 pillars: tillage, chemistry, yield. Tillage meant you worked the soil every year, sometimes twice a year. You ran a disc plow across your fields in the fall, turned everything under, broke up the clods, smoothed the surface, and then you planted. In the spring, after harvest, you tilled again, killed the weeds, prepared the seed bed, got ready for the next rotation. The county extension office recommended it. The Farm Bureau endorsed it. Oklahoma State University's agronomy department had published papers on it. The equipment dealerships in Boise City sold you the implements to do it and financed the ones you couldn't afford outright. Chemistry meant herbicides and fertilizers. At the Cimarron County Co-op on Highway 287, the shelves ran 40 feet long and held every product a wheat farmer might need to kill what shouldn't be growing or feed what should. Men like Dale Rucker, who farmed 1,200 acres just north of the Beaver County line, would spend upward of $80,000 a year on inputs: fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, and consider it a reasonable cost of doing business. That was $80,000 a year, every year, just to maintain the baseline, just to stay even. Yield meant bushels per acre. That was the number. That was the only number. The county agent tracked it. The grain elevator calculated it. The bank financed against it. A good year in Cimarron County in the late 80s was 30 bushels per acre of winter wheat. A bad year was 18. And the goal, every year, was to hold that number up, to spend whatever you had to spend on inputs, do whatever the tillage calendar required, and hit your target. This was not ignorance. This was not stupidity. Darrell Fitch was a smart man with a legitimate graduate degree and years of experience advising farmers who genuinely needed help. Dale Rucker had been farming that land for 23 years and feeding his family off it and paying his loans and sending his kids to college. These were people who knew things, doing things that had worked for a long time. They just hadn't noticed what was happening to the ground underneath them. And here was Gerald Meeks, standing in the Farm Bureau parking lot in June of 1988, asking why his soil didn't smell like anything. Gerald hadn't started out as a questioner. That isn't who he was, and it isn't how he thought of himself. He'd grown up in Boise City, gone to Cimarron High School, graduated in 1956 without particular distinction, spent 2 years in the Army stationed in Kentucky, come home, married a woman named Ruth Ann Bledsoe from Felt, Oklahoma, and bought his first 200 acres from his father-in-law for a price that involved more handshake than cash. He was not a revolutionary. He was not a visionary. He was a wheat farmer in the Oklahoma Panhandle, which was, as he would have been the first to tell you, just about the least glamorous thing a person could be in the state of Oklahoma. What happened to Gerald started on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1985, which was 3 years before he walked into the Farm Bureau office to ask his question. He'd been pulling a disc plow across the east section, the 320 acres on the far side of the county road, and he'd gotten off the tractor to unclog something in the implement, the way you do, and he was down on one knee in the turned soil, working his hand into a clump of dirt to loosen it, when he noticed something. The field smelled wrong. Not bad wrong, not rotten wrong. It just smelled like nothing, like dust, like the inside of a mason jar, like something that had been sealed too long. He stood up and walked to the fence line, where his property ended and his neighbor Roy Giddings' property began. Roy had bought his place from the Kessler family in 1979 and had been farming it quietly ever since. Roy was not a man who went to Farm Bureau meetings or talked much at the co-op. He was 63 years old, had been born in the Panhandle, and as far as anyone knew, had never done anything particularly notable in his life. Roy's field had not been tilled. It was rough and uneven, covered with last year's stubble and what looked like a mess of weeds and dead wheat residue lying flat on the surface. It looked, to Gerald Meeks' eyes, in October of 1985, like a field that hadn't been properly cared for. But it smelled different. Gerald put his hand down into the soil on Roy's side of the fence, just pushed 2 fingers in through the residue into the top inch of ground, and pulled them back up and held them to his nose. It smelled dark, rich, alive, like something was happening in there. He drove to the Boise City Public Library the following Saturday and checked out 4 books. He ordered 2 more through the interlibrary loan system, which took 6 weeks to arrive. He started taking notes in a spiral notebook he bought at TG&Y on Main Street, the kind with the marbled cover, 88 cents. The flaw that almost stopped him was simple and honest. He didn't have the education to understand half of what he was reading. The microbiology went over his head. The chemistry was beyond him. He was a farmer with a high school diploma and 2 years of Army service, not a scientist. There were whole pages he read 3 times and still couldn't follow. So he drove to Roy Giddings' place one afternoon in March of 1986 and knocked on the door and asked Roy if he could ask him some questions about his soil. Roy said, "You want some coffee?" Roy Giddings didn't call it anything. He didn't have a name for what he was doing. He had figured it out the same way a lot of people figure out important things. By accident, through stubbornness, and over a very long time. What Roy had stumbled into, and what Gerald Meeks would spend the next 3 years learning to explain to other people, was what scientists had begun calling the soil food web. But that name came later, from books and universities. And by the time it arrived, Roy and Gerald had already been living it for years. Here is how it actually works. And I want you to follow this carefully, because once you understand it, you'll never look at a farm field, or a garden, or a patch of lawn the same way again. Beneath every acre of healthy soil, there are more living organisms than there are humans on Earth. Bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, beetles, mites. Creatures so small, you can fit 10,000 of them in the period at the end of this sentence. And all of them, every single one, is doing a job. The bacteria break down organic matter, dead plant roots, fallen leaves, the bodies of last season's insects. They convert that dead material into nutrients, but they don't give those nutrients directly to the plant. They hold them the way a savings account holds money, locked up inside their own cells. Tiny little nutrient banks, billions of them, living in the top 6 inches of your soil. Now enter the fungi. The fungi do something extraordinary. They grow long, thread-like structures called hyphae. Think of them as underground cables that connect to the roots of your wheat plant on one end and reach out through the soil to bacteria colonies on the other. The wheat plant feeds sugars to the fungi through its roots. In exchange, the fungi use those cables to harvest nutrients from the bacterial cells and deliver them directly to the plant. It is a trade, a deal, a market that has been running for 400 million years. When it works, the plant gets exactly the nutrients it needs, delivered exactly when it needs them. The plant doesn't have to grow as many roots. It doesn't have to work as hard. It conserves energy that it can put toward yield and grain quality. And here is the part that changes everything. The fungi also build structure. Their hyphae bind soil particles together into aggregates, little clumps, like tiny bricks, that create channels through the soil. Channels that hold air. Channels that hold water. Roy Giddings's untilled field was full of these channels. Millions of them. The water went in and stayed in, held by the architecture that 40 years of undisturbed fungal growth had built in the top foot of his soil. Gerald's field had been tilled. Every pass of the disc plow shredded the fungal networks, sliced the hyphae into pieces too small to function. Every tillage pass, twice a year, was an act of destruction against the very system that was supposed to be feeding his crops. And the synthetic fertilizers he was adding to compensate, those were throwing the bacterial ecology off balance, feeding the wrong organisms, creating boom and bust cycles underground that left his soil dumber and deader every season. Call it the tillage trap, Every time Gerald tilled to control weeds, he destroyed the biology that would have helped his plants outcompete those weeds. So he tilled again, and destroyed more biology, and needed more fertilizer to compensate, and spent more money, and needed a better yield to cover the costs, and pushed the soil harder. The tillage trap has been springing on farmers all across the southern plains for 60 years. It is still springing right now, on fields in Texas and Kansas and Colorado and New Mexico, on farmland that costs more per acre than ever and produces less biological wealth than it has since before Europeans arrived. Roy's soil smelled alive because it was alive. Gerald's soil smelled like nothing because it was nearly dead, and Gerald had been the one killing it, one tillage pass at a time. Gerald stopped tilling his east section in the fall of 1986. 320 acres, left rough and unworked, covered in wheat stubble, and what the people in town were already beginning to call Gerald's mess. By spring of 1987, the talk at the Coffee Cup Diner on Main Street had reached a volume that was hard to ignore. Dale Rucker, who held court at the big round table near the window most mornings, put it plainly one Tuesday in April. "That man has lost his mind," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I drove by his east section yesterday. You know what it looks like? It looks like he quit, like he just flat quit and drove away." He said it to the table, but he was saying it to everyone in the room. A man named Theo Wagoner, who ran the co-op, said he'd been in the business long enough to know what happened to fields that didn't get worked. The weeds come up, the soil hardens, you lose the moisture, you lose the yield. I've seen it 100 times. He hadn't, specifically, but he'd been told it was true by people who seemed to know, and in Cimarron County in 1987, that was usually enough. The extension agent, Darrell Fitch, heard about Gerald's experiment and drove out to look. He walked the field boundary, looked at the stubble and the residue lying rough on the surface, and wrote in his field notes, "Poor soil management practices. Recommend immediate attention." He mailed a copy to Gerald. Gerald did not respond to the letter. He kept his head down. He planted his east section with a no-till drill he'd borrowed from Roy Giddings, a battered old implement that Roy had ordered from a company in Nebraska 3 years before, and that nobody else in the county even knew existed. He drove home and tried to read more of his books and told Ruth Ann that night that he was pretty sure he was right about this. Ruth Ann said she believed him. That was about the size of his support network. There was one evening in January of 1988 when the temperature had dropped to 4 degrees and the wind was doing what the wind does in the Oklahoma Panhandle in January, and Gerald sat at the kitchen table with his spiral notebook and his library books and looked at what he'd written and felt, for the first and only time, genuinely uncertain. He wasn't a scientist. He was a wheat farmer. What if he was just wrong? What if Roy's field smelled different for some other reason entirely? Soil type, water table, something he couldn't measure. He went to bed. He got up the next morning and drove out to check his east section in the cold. The ground was covered in frost. The wheat stubble was silver and still. And underneath it, invisible to everyone who drove past on the county road and shook their heads at Gerald's mess, something was alive and working in the dark. He got back in the truck. He drove home. He started reading again. The summer of 1988 was the driest summer in the Oklahoma Panhandle since the Dust Bowl. There had been dry summers before. There was always a dry summer somewhere in the rotation. You planned for it, you worried about it, you hoped your winter wheat was in the ground and established before the heat arrived. But 1988 was different. It didn't just get dry. It got relentlessly, systematically, devastatingly dry, in a way that exposed every weakness in every system, all at once. By the third week of June, Dale Rucker had already written off 200 acres of spring-planted crops. Completely written off, not yields will be lower, but that ground is not producing anything this year, and we are going to figure out how to cover the loan payment some other way. The soil on his fields had crusted hard on top, sealed by the heat, and when a rare quarter-inch of rain came on a Thursday in late June, the water sheeted off the surface and ran to the road ditch and was gone. The soil didn't take it. Couldn't take it. The structure wasn't there to receive it. Darrell Fitch made 11 farm visits in July of 1988. 11 different farms with problems he couldn't solve. He recommended irrigation on fields where there was no well. He recommended inputs on fields where there was no money. He drove from property to property in his state-issued pickup and took notes in his clipboard and went home at night and sat in his kitchen and understood in a quiet and terrible way that the tools he had been taught to use did not work in this kind of situation. Theo Wagoner at the co-op sold more herbicide in the summer of 1988 than in any previous year in the store's history. Farmers desperately chasing weeds in the bare, exposed ground, fighting for any advantage, spending money they didn't have on a problem that chemicals couldn't fix. And on the east side of a county road, southeast of Boise City, Gerald Meeks's 320 untilled acres sat under the same sun, under the same heat, under the same rainless sky. And they did not fail. The wheat stubble and the residue on the surface acted like insulation, kept the soil temperature down, kept the moisture from evaporating, held what little rain came, and let it sink in through the channels the fungi had built. The biology in the soil processed the stress differently than bare, tilled ground could. The roots went deeper because the soil structure let them. The plants drew on a water reserve that simply did not exist in the fields across the road. One morning in late July, Dale Rucker stopped his truck on the county road. He'd been driving past Gerald's east section for 2 years and shaking his head at the stubble and the mess. Now he sat in his truck with the engine running and looked at what was in front of him. On his left, his own field. Brown, cracked across the surface in hexagonal plates, the way drought does to clay-heavy soil when it dries completely out. A few stunted plants still standing, scattered in yellow, more dead than alive. On his right, Gerald's east section, green, not brilliant, not lush. It was 1988 in the Oklahoma Panhandle. Nothing was brilliant or lush, but green. Alive. Standing. Dale turned off his engine. He sat there. He could see both fields from the driver's seat without moving his head. Green on one side, brown on the other. The fence line between them running straight and indifferent from the road to the horizon. He sat in that truck for a long time. Long enough that a Cimarron County road crew truck came over the hill from the east and slowed down to see if he needed help, and Dale waved them on and then sat there some more. Then he started the engine, turned around in the road, and drove to Gerald Meeks's farmhouse. Gerald was in the shop when Dale pulled in, had the hood of the old Dodge up, and was sorting through a box of bolts looking for something. He heard the truck and came around the corner wiping his hands on a rag. Dale Rucker got out of his pickup He was 62 years old, farmed 1,200 acres, had been in the county all his life. He did not look at Gerald. He looked at the shop floor. He said, "I need to understand what you're doing over there." Gerald put the rag in his back pocket. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he said, "You want some coffee?" They sat at Gerald and Ruth Ann's kitchen table for 2.5 hours. Gerald pulled books off the shelf, the ones from the library, the ones he'd ordered through interlibrary loan, the newer ones he'd been buying from a catalog. He spread them on the table. He drew a diagram on a piece of notebook paper showing the fungal networks, the bacteria, the way the aggregates formed, the way water moved through structured versus compacted soil. He used a glass of water and the kitchen table to demonstrate drainage. He talked about the tillage trap. Dale asked questions. Real questions, not hostile ones. He asked how long it took. He asked whether it worked on heavier clay soils like the ones on his north section. He asked about the weeds. How do you control the weeds if you're not tilling? He asked about the economics, the cost difference, the break-even point. Gerald answered every question he could. For the ones he couldn't, he said, "I don't know. Let's look it up." He gave Dale one of the books to take home. By the following spring, Dale Rucker had committed 160 acres of his ground to a no-till trial. He borrowed Gerald's no-till drill. Roy Giddings had sold it to Gerald in the fall of 1988, and Gerald had bought a second one and planted his west section without touching a disc plow. The conversation spread the way conversations do in small counties with long winters. Gerald wasn't talking much. He was farming. But Dale was talking, at the coffee cup, at the grain elevator, at the Farm Bureau annual meeting in February of 1989, where he stood up during the open discussion period and said something that the room was not expecting. He said, "I was wrong about Gerald Meeks, and I want to say that out loud. There were maybe 40 farmers in that room. Some of them had been part of the coffee shop conversations. Some of them had driven past Gerald's east section during the summer of 1988 and seen the same fence line Dale had seen. A few had already been quietly asking Gerald questions of their own. By the fall of 1989, 12 farmers in Cimarron County had some portion of their ground in no-till or reduced-till systems. Gerald helped every one of them. He drove to their farms. He answered their calls. He drew the same diagram on notebook paper with the same glass of water at a dozen different kitchen tables. He never once mentioned what they'd said about him at the coffee cup. Not to any of them. Not ever. The thing Gerald told people, when they asked him the simplest version of what he'd figured out, was this: "You've been treating your soil like a container to grow things in. It's not a container. It's a community. You don't manage a community by plowing it under twice a year." That was it. That was the whole thing, in 38 words. Gerald Meeks farmed his 640 acres southeast of Boise City until 2007, when he was 70 years old, and his left knee had given out completely, and Ruth Ann's health made it necessary for him to be closer to town. He sold the operation to his son-in-law, a man named Craig Blevins from Liberal, Kansas, and moved into a house on Cimarron Avenue, a mile from the Coffee Cup Diner, where, for the better part of a decade, people had said he'd lost his mind. He did not receive an award from the Oklahoma State University Agronomy Department. The county extension office never wrote a paper about him. The Farm Bureau did not give him a plaque. What happened instead was quieter and more permanent. By 2005, there were more than 400,000 acres of no-till farmland in Cimarron County and the surrounding Panhandle counties. Not all of it traced back to Gerald. The practices had been spreading nationally since the 80s, documented in university research and USDA reports, and the work of a dozen different people in a dozen different states who had been figuring out the same thing at roughly the same time. Some of those people had better access to publications. Some had university positions. Some had gotten to the idea first and gotten the credit that went with it. Gerald had gotten to the fence line. That was his contribution. That specific fence line on a specific county road in the summer of a specific drought, where one man sat in a truck with the engine off and looked at the difference between what he'd been doing and what was possible. Dale Rucker converted his entire 1,200 acres to no-till by 1994. He cut his input spending by 40%. His yields in dry years held in a way they never had before. He farmed until he was 74, which was longer than he'd planned on farming, and he said more than once in his later years that those extra years were Gerald's fault. Darrell Fitch, the extension agent, retired in 1999 and was replaced by a young woman named Karen Sessoms, who had done her graduate work on soil biology at Kansas State and who drove to Gerald's farm in her first month on the job, introduced herself, and asked if she could walk his fields and ask him some questions. Gerald made her coffee and spent 3 hours with her. Roy Giddings died in 1993. He is buried in the Boise City Cemetery, northeast corner, under a stone that says his name and the years he was born and died and nothing else. The things he figured out in his fields are still working in thousands of acres of Oklahoma soil that he never saw and never knew about. That is the truest kind of legacy, the kind that doesn't know your name. Gerald Meeks died on a Saturday morning in February of 2019 at the age of 82 in a hospital in Guymon, Oklahoma. He had been, right up until about 6 months before, driving out to Craig Blevins' operation, his old ground, to walk the fields in the fall and check the soil after harvest, just to see, just to put his hand down and smell it. It still smelled alive. Here is what I want you to consider as we end this story. At some point in your life, you have been Darrell Fitch. You were the person with the credentials and the clipboard and the institutional authority, and someone came to you with a question that didn't fit the framework you'd been given, and you answered with the framework instead of the question. You did it because that is what frameworks are for. That is not a character flaw. That is how knowledge works when it hardens into institution. And at some point, maybe you've been Gerald Meeks. You noticed something that didn't fit. You followed it, not because you were brave, not because you were a visionary, but because you couldn't stop thinking about it. And the people around you, the reasonable people, the educated people, the people with the credentials, told you that you were wrong. And you kept going anyway, not with speeches, not with righteousness, just with a spiral notebook and some library books and a borrowed implement and a willingness to be wrong in a very visible and public way, for as long as it took. The thing that saved Gerald's crops in the drought of 1988 wasn't genius. It wasn't revolution. It was the decision to stop doing something that wasn't working, even when everyone around him was doing it harder. Sometimes the ground knows more than the plow.